Today we have Dr. Matt Parrott and the Center for Delusional Reasoning.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks for inviting me to this. They close these. Is that okay for that? Do you know if it's open? Is that okay? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about delusional reasoning. The title on the last slide was better, so I'll just ignore this one. So to get started, I think if you look at psychiatric textbooks and diagnostic manuals and lots of different neuropsychiatric models of delusion, they're very often characterized in terms of impairments in reasoning or in terms of delusional subjects being irrational in some way. So you can find this kind of language really all over the place. It's not hard to find. So here's a very provocative passage from a kind of introductory book by Parrott and Johnston, where they say that sufferers from this disorder are irrational and they behave in ways that are impossible to understand. So that's pessimistic, but irrationality is right in there. You get similar sorts of things suggested by clinical diagnostic criteria. So this is a extraction from the DSM. Delusions are fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. They're deemed bizarre if they're clearly implausible and not understandable to same culture peers, and do not derive from ordinary life experiences. So these are all kinds of things that you might think suggest that delusions are irrational. So if you think that beliefs ordinarily are rational responses to evidence, delusional beliefs looks like they're being classified as irrational responses to evidence. So the fact that they're not going to be changed when you give people conflicting evidence for them, that they're not derived from ordinary life experiences, these are things that kind of suggest to people that delusions might be irrational. I'm going to give you some examples of some delusions just so that we all have a clear picture of the kind of thing that we're talking about. So there's this delusion called Capgras delusion, which is a delusion of misidentification. It happens when someone will mistake very usually a family member for an imposter. So this is a description by a woman that Young is interviewing. She says, "There's been someone like my son's double walking around the house, which isn't my son. I can tell my son because my son is different, but you have to be quick to notice it." So she thinks that her son's kind of been replaced by an imposter. This is a delusion that you get in schizophrenia. You can also get it from stroke, from just lesioning the brain. There's another delusion which it's called Cotard syndrome. Sometimes people call it the Cotard delusion, where an individual reports that they believe that they're dead. So this is a person that is talking about her own experience. This says that she was dead. She was adamant she died 2 weeks prior to the assessment. She was extremely distressed, which you would be if you thought you were dead. Not all people are distressed about this. And was very anxious to learn whether or not the hospital that she was in was heaven. Here's a case of someone who has a kind of more elaborated delusion. It's in quite a long passage, but I have the whole thing up here because I think it gives you a flavor of how not just a particular belief can seem irrational, but about how a whole kind of line or train of thought might seem like it's exhibiting a kind of irrationality. So this is this person talking about, they're just kind of talking, and they start off talking about how the game took on huge proportions. And you might think, well, what game? This is the first time they mention the game. So it's not like we've been talking about the game for 5 minutes and now they're saying some more things. They just start talking about this game. The game took on huge proportions. Not only was I convinced that my hometown was manipulating things, I also thought the nation as a whole was participating and fooling me. In Lake City, I thought adults were playing basketball in teams in the Civic Center for me. Nationwide, I thought the President of the United States was going to visit me. So I was very nervous in my apartment thinking that he would arrive soon. After a few days when he didn't come, I decided he'd changed his mind. Eventually, the game seemed to have gone just too far. I needed to do something dramatic to stop it. The final straw was the morning when I woke up and felt the shadow of Satan was on my living room floor. Satan, I thought, was beginning to take advantage of me. It's a little bit more elaborate, but you can sort of feel, so when I read this passage, I sort of feel like the person's drawing connections between things, but I'm not quite getting how the things are connected because they're not connected in a way that things would ordinarily be connected. I think it's very natural for people to find all those kinds of reports puzzling. So the Capricorn case is puzzling, the Cotard case is puzzling, and the game is puzzling. And you can start, very easily asking yourself questions like, how is it that someone could come to think that their son is an imposter? What sort of thing would lead you to think that your son isn't your son, but an imposter that looks just like your son? What sort of thing would lead you to think that you're dead and not alive? And what sort of thing would lead you to start thinking that you're playing this game with Satan and that he's starting to take advantage of the game in some way? So what is the stuff that's happening in your environment that's leading you to think these sorts of things? And it's a short step from being puzzled by questions like this to sort of thinking like, well, there's something irrational going on. So like there's some irrational process that leads you to think that your family member is an imposter, or there's some irrational process that leads you to think that you're dead, because there's no reasonable line of thinking that goes from the kind of evidence that's available to you to the belief that you're now dead, or the evidence that's available to you to the belief that your son is a duplicate or an imposter and not your son. And when you take that very natural reaction, you see it kind of repeated in textbooks and in diagnostic manuals and different kinds of neuropsychiatric models. It's very, very common for people to think that delusions are characterized by a kind of irrationality. Even if we don't know how the reasoning is breaking down, we have this strong sense that it is irrational in some way, that being delusional, it exhibits some form of irrationality. The question that I want to start with today is I want to ask whether it's really true, whether it is really the case that the patterns of reasoning we find in delusional subjects are irrational. And I've just given you a bunch of examples of delusions and suggested that they very naturally lead you to think that there's irrationality involved. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to give you 3 different cases that should call that into question in some way, that should make you think, well, hey, wait, maybe delusional subjects aren't so irrational. Maybe they're a lot less irrational than we thought they were. If I'm right about the cases, then maybe we should resist this idea that delusional subjects are irrational or that they have a problem with reasoning. So here's the first case. The first case is jumping to conclusions. Can I just ask really quickly, how many of you, if any of you, are familiar with these experiments? One person? Okay, that's good, because we can do the experiment. So that'll help. So the jumping to conclusions experiment is a selection task that's designed to assess probabilistic reasoning. There are 2 jars. Jar A has 85 red beads and 15 blue beads in it. Jar B has 85 blue beads and 15 red beads in it. I don't have jars or beads. I have the next best thing. I have boxes with coins in them. So the blue box has 85 2p coins and 15 1p coins, and the white box is the converse. So it's the same ratios, we're using money and we're using boxes. So this is how the experiment goes. I'm hiding with 2 different boxes. One has 85 1p, one has 85 2p, 100 coins in each. I'm hiding boxes so you can't see them, right? No one can see the boxes if you can, I'll just move the chair over so you can't see the boxes. I'm going to select the box. You don't know which box I selected. I'm going to start drawing coins out of it. I'll tell you what they are. And all you have to do is tell me to stop when you know which box I picked. Okay? Simple enough? Does everybody get the experiment? We're doing it right now, so get ready. All right. So I have a 2p coin. You can just raise your hand when I'm to stop. Okay.
Are you doing replacement?
Yeah, I'm putting it back in. That preserves the ratio. It also makes it easier for you. So if you're doing math right now, be grateful that I'm putting the coin back. Okay, so I'm going back into the box. I have a 2p coin. $2p coin. $2p coin. A couple people want me to stop. $2p coin. The 2p coin. 6 in a row. Okay, so want me to go? It's okay. 2p coin. 7 in a row. Should I keep going?
Yes.
No. Surely you can never know.
You can never know.
No.
Not even after I.
Could it be the same coin?
Huh?
The same coin.
It could be, I guess, but there is more than one coin in here. There. 2p coin, that's 8 in a row. Should I keep going? Okay.
What was the goal?
You should tell me to stop when you know which box I've chosen. You just told me to stop at 4. So when I
Is the goal to stop? Who will guess the first? Who will guess the right box quickest? Is that?
your goal is just to tell me to stop when you know which box I've chosen.
Oh.
And you said 4 draws. That's
Oh, I misunderstood. There's no need to stop.
you want me to keep going? Your goal might be to just have me go and draw coins eternally, but I'm going to stop because let's just leave it at that. So somewhere in there, at some point in there, did you feel like you knew which box I picked? So I picked the box that has more 2p coins than 1p coins. And you, I don't know. So I don't know where you were feeling like it. So some people said 4. A few people wanted me to keep going. When people are given this experiment, most people tell the experimenter to stop around between 6 and 7 draws when you're getting consecutive draws like this. Right? So I gave you a bunch of consecutive draws of the 2p coin. In that kind of context, most people wait until they get 6 or 7. Okay? Except for delusional people. So delusional people tell people to stop between 2 and 3. So they jump to conclusions. That's what the data is supposed to show you. They're faster at telling the experimenter to stop at this kind of thing than controls are. They do it more quickly. So here's the conclusion that Gary and Freeman have to say. There's strong support for reasoning bias in people with delusions, which is best described as a data gathering bias, a tendency to gather less evidence than controls so that they jump to conclusions. And the evidence for this is that in this bead experiment that I just did with you, people that have delusions only need 2 or 3 draws before they tell the experimenter to stop. People who are not delusional wait until 6 or 7 draws.
By delusional, do you mean people who have psychosis or schizophrenia?
People who are, so this study's been done loads of times. So it's true for people that are schizophrenic as well, that they jump to conclusions. But it's just a broad range of delusional subjects exhibit this. So some people are psychotic, some of them not psychotic. As long as they have some diagnosis of delusional disorder in some way. And I think, Yeah.
Some sort of mental disorder that relates to delusions in some way.
They're diagnosed at some point with delusions. They don't have to be psychotic. They don't have to be, they may have been psychotic in the past and not psychotic now. I don't know if there's an experiment that's been done by neuropsychiatry more than this. This is a very robust finding in a range of slight variations. So delusional subjects jump to conclusions. They tell me to stop before you do. What a lot of people in cognitive science are worried about doing is thinking about, well, what explains this? Why do they do this sort of thing? And here are a few proposals. So the Garrity and Friedman proposal is that there's a data gathering bias. What they think basically is that if you're delusional, you just rapidly accept propositions as they're presented to you. If somebody sort of presents something to you and you're a delusional person, you just say, yeah, that sounds good. I'm going to go with that. A different idea that was floated is that delusional subjects don't like kind of open questions. They like things to be closed off. So when you give them a task or a question, they want to stop it as soon as possible. And so once you start drawing beats, they're like, okay, let's end this. I don't like what's happening to me. The third possibility here is that the young mental possibility is that they have a hard time processing sequences of information. So if you give them a task that has to have them keep track of a lot of things, they don't really know what to do. Other people have said that they have problems with working memory. That's why they jump to conclusions. There's lots of different things that people have suggested. And I don't really care about those because what I want to draw attention to is whether what's happening is really an impairment in reasoning. So one of the best ways that we have to think about kind of probabilistic reasoning is using Bayes' rule to determine probabilities and how you should update probabilities in terms of evidence. And if you plug all this data into just a Bayesian algorithm, these are the kinds of results that you get. If you get one red draw, the probability that you've chosen the red dominant draw is 0.85. If you get two, the probability you've chosen the red dominant jar is 0.97. If you get three, it's like 0.9997. It's around 0.9997, something along those lines. Those are pretty good odds. So you're getting very, very high probabilities after 3 consecutive red draws or 3 consecutive 2p coins that it's the red jar, the red dominant jar. And what that suggests, or you might think it suggests, is that the delusional subjects are performing close to what the Bayesian algorithm kicks out. So they tell you to stop between 2 and 3. And between 2 and 3, the probability is going from 0.97 to 0.999. When you get to 4, it doesn't go up that much more. Similarly, when you get to 5, you're getting very, 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 very marginal gains on probability at that point in time. The biggest jumps happen right at the beginning, and that's when they say to stop. So it looks like you're the ones who are bad at this. Like you're taking too long to figure out which jar has been chosen. You have enough information to make the selection at the beginning. So if that's right, at least when it comes to probabilistic reasoning in this task, it looks like the people that have delusions are doing pretty good. And it's a mistake to think that they're impaired or that they're exhibiting some sort of reasoning impairment. Yeah.
Question, but wouldn't that assume though that they would have that understanding of probability in the first place to be able to make that reasoning? So that the average person might not have that understanding of probability.
So I guess it depends on what you think happens in this kind of experimental test. So it could. So when I do it, when I first did it, I didn't sort of think about anything. I just kind of people were like presenting beats to me, and then I just said stop at some point. So I wasn't sort of consciously consulting the probability calculus and trying to work out equations in this kind of explicit manner. But you might think that, nevertheless, my brain is doing those things. So when you present me with sort of probabilistic problems, my brain can just compute probabilities and kick out answers in certain ways. And that might be what's going on both with control subjects and with delusional subjects. It might be that this is just, they're approaching the problem this way, even though they're not kind of explicitly and consciously approaching the problem this way. So when I say here that they're approximating a Bayesian algorithm, what I mean is that their behavior, I mean, it just looks like they're performing the same way that you might expect if you were just plugging these things into a computer. But it doesn't look irrational. It doesn't look like they're reasoning badly. They're making good judgments based on what our best theories tell us. Yeah.
This might be a question to come back to.
Okay.
And this might just be a personal report, but it seems that when you set up the experiment with us, you called it a jumping to conclusion experiment.
Yeah.
And then, which sort of surprised me, so I couldn't see your face, whether you were looking at the thing.
Yeah.
So, like, maybe, very early on, you're still
Yeah.
thinking, okay, that's right, but you're also thinking of alternate possibilities, and then suddenly the probabilities go down. So
Yeah.
the thought, it was when you said,
Yeah.
like, so your head wasn't
I see.
looking down, when you said you weren't holding on to the same point, like other
Are you trying
possibilities.
to rationalize your poor performance?
I think not.
It's okay.
But what I'm saying is, like,
It's defensive.
it's,
I
there's a
take the
lot more
point.
calculation
Yeah,
going
no, I
on
take the
than just that one.
I mean, this wasn't a good experiment in this room, right? I mean, there was loads of.
But I guess my question is, how is it done? Like,
It's
is
not. All they're done is they're shown the jars,
Right.
and they're asked the design question. They're like, we're gonna do this thing. Here's some jars. Here's the ratios. I'm gonna hide them. Pick one. You just tell me. When you know which one I've.
Right.
So they're not. It's not called the jumping to conclusions experiment. There's no background about irrationality and anything like that going on. It's not like that.
Okay.
They're actually showing jars that have the. I don't actually have 200 coins here. I mean, there's.
Right.
So, yeah, you can skip if you don't want to discuss that, but I was thinking, suppose you have a jar with 97 black and 3 red, and you take a ball out of that and you don't show it to me.
I don't show it to you.
Yeah, you don't show it to me. So you take a ball out of the 97 black, 1 red.
Yeah.
You ask me, is it black?
Yeah.
I'm going to say, yeah, probably it's black.
Yeah.
You ask me, do you know that it's black?
Yeah.
I'm going to say, no, I don't know that it's black. It's
Yeah.
probably black, but I don't know that it's black.
Yeah.
So here, I feel it makes a difference whether you ask people, is it the 2-coin box? Or you ask people, stop when you know that it's a 2-coin box.
Yeah.
I mean, this seems the Bayesian algorithm would say, I know, if the Bayesian algorithm would say, I know in the black bead, with 97, but
Yeah.
the Bayesian algorithm tells you something about the probability that it's black, not about whether you know.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, so you have to. So people are asked when to stop when they're certain or when they know, typically. And the Bayesian framework doesn't give you kind of formally defined point about knowledge.
You could say it even tells you that you're not certain that it's black.
Yeah. I mean, you
If have
might
97
think that the idea that they're performing like the algorithm says is a kind of it's an intuition you have to have. You have to have the intuition that 0.99 is a good place to stop.
to be certain. So if you have 97 black
Yeah.
box and 3 red, and I take a
Yeah.
bit and I said, are you
I
certain
mean, so-
that it's black? Then the Bayesian should say, yes, I'm certain it's black.
I mean, so maybe the way to think of it is like this: do you think you're more certain after 5 draws?
I mean, you call it a very small difference, 97 to
Yeah.
997. But if you express probabilities in logarithm, it's a big jump. It kind of depends on how you state the, if it is 10 times closer to
No, no,
the sentence. So there's also.
Can we come back to questions?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I'll give you the other case. My next two don't involve probabilities. So the second one is most problems. So here's the experiment. We can do this too. Here's a task. Assume that the premises of the arguments are true to make the conclusion true. Argument 1, premise, all buildings speak loudly. 2, a hospital does not speak loudly. Conclusion, therefore a hospital is not a building. Is that true or false? Argument 2, the sun rises, and the sun is in the east. 2, the sun is in the east, therefore the sun rises. Assuming the premises are true, they make a conclusion true or false. There's some discrepancy going on. So the top argument is valid, but it doesn't make sense. So according to, if those two premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. It's a valid logical argument. This is an invalid argument. It's affirming the consequent. It's a classic fallacy, and logic happens all the time. And one thing that we know is that people who are evaluating arguments with conditionals in them are very, very susceptible to believability biases. So whether or not a person thinks an argument is good or bad depends on how believable they think the statements are. So people tend to think that this is a good argument because everything is plausible. People tend to think that that's a bad argument because everything's implausible. That's the general scope of how believability bias works in the population. Except there's evidence that delusional people don't fall for this. So there's some evidence that they evaluate these arguments better than controls do. They don't sort of fall in for the believability bias. It's tested on schizophrenic subjects who are delusional, so it might be that schizophrenia is playing some other role in there. But they evaluate the arguments correctly. They get the valid arguments as valid, they get the invalid arguments as invalid. They're not thrown off by the fact that the invalid arguments have sort of plausible premises and conclusions. And that's an interesting result because whatever's going on in the non-delusional, non-schizophrenic population doesn't look like it's affecting them when they're given this. There's not as much data on this, but there's some evidence that suggests it. And that goes contrary to sort of prevalent misconception that delusional subjects are subject to, that they're bad at reasoning with stuff. So earlier in the 20th century, there was this thought that people that had delusions did what is called von Dahmer style reasoning, which they made identifications based on predicate positions. So they would say things like, it's hot in here, hell's hot, I'm in hell. But there actually isn't very much data to support that. But there is data that suggests that they reason pretty well with conditions, at least some data. So that's my second case that suggests that they're reasoning well. They're tracking validity. Here's the third case. This is kind of cool. We could do this too, but it'd be really hard. So I'll just tell you what it is. Here's the experiment. You're given an array of shapes with colors, and you're given a conditional rule. So the conditional rule here is if there's not a red square on the left, then there's a yellow circle on the right. That's the conditional. And your job is to make that false. The way you make it false is you just rearrange the shapes. So in the actual experiment, you're given actual shapes, so you can move them around. And all you have to do is arrange the shapes in such a way that makes that conditional false. So in this particular case, that's a possible way of falsifying the condition. This is wrong. Now, when they were doing these experiments, what they found is that people are pretty good at falsifying conditional rules with shapes until we insert a negation into the antecedent of the conditional. Once you put a negation in the antecedent of the conditional, performance drops off a ton. People just can't handle it. In particular, they alter this as an answer, which is not correct. Except one group of people who don't who don't start screwing up. That's schizophrenic people with delusions. So they do very well. They are given all sorts of conditional rules. They give more correct responses and falsification tasks. But a lot of them only made one error. Lots and lots of control subjects failed all of the conditional rules they were given with negation. And the psychiatric population as well. So that's interesting. Because it suggests, I mean, one thing it suggests is that they might be processing negations differently. But that rule is hard for people to falsify. People really struggle with it. Even when you give them, I mean, there's not a time limit. They can take as long as they want to. People just can't, they just don't know what to do. So that's the third case where the delusional subjects look like you're doing better. So I think all the cases kind of give you tasks, cognitive tasks or problems, where it looks like people with delusions perform better than non-delusional subjects, and they come closer to approximating our best theories of reasoning. So they're good with deductive arguments involving conditionals, they're good with falsifying conditionals, they look like they're pretty good with probability, modulo the kinds of concerns that Julia is raising. So my thought is, well, maybe they're not as irrational as we thought. Maybe they're a bit more rational than the kind of standard ways of thinking make them out to be. And so that leads to the second question that I want to talk just a bit about, which is, could this help us explain delusions? If we stop thinking that delusions are, in principle, irrational things, might we have more options available for thinking about how they come about? That takes me back to a thesis that Brendan Maher proposed a long time ago. So Brendan Maher was a psychologist, principally worked in neuropsychology. And he thought this about delusions. He thought this for a long time. He thought that this is how people become delusional. This is strange events that are felt to be significant demand explanations. And the core of my hypothesis that the explanations, delusions, of the patient are derived by cognitive activity that is essentially indistinguishable from that employed by non-patients, by scientists, and by people generally. In brief, a delusion is a hypothesis designed to explain an unusual perceptual phenomenon developed through the operation of normal cognitive processes. So Maher's view is, what happens when you develop a delusion is you have some weird experience, some sort of strange thing happens to you, and you turn to the delusion to explain that thing. And you'll notice in the passage that he says the cognitive processes involved in delusion are the same ones that are involved in ordinary cognition. They're indistinguishable. They're just normal cognitive processes. There's nothing irrational about what the delusional person is doing. They've just been confronted with a very kind of strange experience. That's the proposal. So you have this kind of transition going on. You have this weird experience. The delusional belief comes up. The delusional belief comes up because the person's trying to explain the occurrence of this strange experience. That's the whole framework for how he thinks that people become delusional. And that passage I put up was from 1970s, and there's been subsequently a lot of resistance to Maher's view. I don't think a lot of people think it's right. And all the resistance is sort of based around this notion that delusions are so irrational that they couldn't possibly be explanatory. They're highly irrational responses to experiences, so they're not going to explain those experiences. And that's the worry. But we've already seen some reasons to think, well, maybe delusions aren't as irrational as people make them out to be. So I think the challenge is, if we want to understand things along Maher's lines, you have to clarify how that transition can be explanatory. How it could be that you move from a weird experience of the world to a delusional belief in a way that seems reasonable, or a way that seems like it could be a plausible explanation for the weird experience that you're going to have. And in the time that I have left, I'm just going to suggest I'm going to sketch the way that sort of explanation would go just for one delusion. So I'm going to focus on the Capra delusion and just kind of sketch out for you how the explanation should look. The thing I'm going to say is not a complete explanation of the delusion, but it should show you where work needs to be done, and kind of generally the picture that Maher is proposing and how it would go. So we need to understand two things. We have to understand the experience, what this weird thing is that people are trying to explain, and we need to understand how it could be that a cognitive process generates a delusion as an explanation of the experience. And here's how it looks for Capra. So what happens in Capra? You think this person who looks just like your mother isn't your mother. They're an imposter instead. So the first thing we want to think about is what kind of experience would make you think that your mother is an imposter? Why would you think that sort of thing? She's your mother, after all. I mean, she's actually your mother. In all the delusional cases, too, it's the person's actual mother. And here's the proposal. This is a kind of proposal that goes back to some work that Alice and Young started in the early 90s. Here's a pretty plausible picture of how we see faces. So the thought is that when you see a face, there are kind of two streams of processing that goes on. There's one stream that they call facial recognition unit, which just sort of stores identifying information about faces when you see a familiar face. And then there's another stream that runs through your autonomic nervous system, which generates a feeling of familiarity for faces. These are for faces that you're familiar with in some way. Okay? We know that humans are very good at recognizing faces, generally. So it wouldn't be surprising if we had a couple of different things going on to help us with those tasks. And what Alice and Young suggested is like, since there are two different streams, we could impair either one. And when you impair the facial recognition units, this is what happens. You see faces, and they feel familiar to you, but you can't recognize them because you can't access any of the identifying information. And there's a condition, prosopagnosia, where that's what happens. People see faces that they don't recognize, and they feel like they know the person. And Alice and Young said, well, maybe the converse is exactly what happens in the Capra delusion. So the facial recognitions are on task, so you know that the person looks just like your mother. You can draw on identifying information, but they don't feel like your mother. You don't have that kind of warm feeling that you get every time you see your mother. That's the thought. And that hypothesis generates some sort of like empirically testable consequences, and those have been confirmed in a variety of experiments. So you can measure skin conductance responses on people when they look at faces. And it looks like people with Capra delusion have a kind of non-responsive autonomic nervous system, which is what the hypothesis suggests. And so that's the proposal for the kind of weird experience they have. They have a visual experience of their mother, but this normal kind of like feeling of familiarity that we all have when we look at our mothers is just missing. And so they're in the situation where they see someone that looks just like their mother, but doesn't feel like their mother. And that's a strange experience. So that gets us the first bit of the picture. That sort of helps us understand maybe what the strange experience is that needs to be made sense of. The next bit is to explain, well, how come when they have this experience, they adopt this imposter belief as an explanation of it? So you could think of it like this. So they have this experience, there's something weird about this person that I'm looking at. They look like my mother, but they don't feel like my mother. And you might think, well, they have a variety of hypotheses available to them. So one hypothesis is the one they actually go in for. They go in for imposter. They think, well, that's because she's an imposter. Another hypothesis might be a kind of mother hypothesis. You could think, well, this person's my mother, but something's wrong with her. You can get kind of like weird experiences of people's faces when they do something sudden or dramatic with them. So like if you know somebody and they cut their hair in a very strange way, or they get their hair colored, or they shave off their beard, or they get plastic surgery or something like that, you'll see them and you'll get this kind of weird feeling a little bit. But you don't think they're an imposter. You might think like something's different with you. I can't quite put my finger on it. Another thing that you might think in these cases is you might have a hypothesis about brain injury. So a lot of people develop Parrott after stroke. And you might think like, well, if you're in this position where you're having this strange experience, one hypothesis is you could have is that something's wrong with your brain. Like you just had this stroke the other week. Maybe that's doing something. So it looks like, I don't know how you feel about this. It looks like imposters maybe not the best explanation of the strange experience. At least you might think it's not the best explanation of the strange experience. Like there's all these other possible explanations. And so there's this question about why delusional subjects pick it. Why do they go for an imposter rather than any of these other things to explain why they have this strange experience of their mind? We know, we're pretty confident they have this strange experience of their mind. But is that really enough to choose imposter as an explanation rather than some other kind of explanation? And you can sort of think, so sometimes when I think about this, I try to get my head around what non-delusional people would do in the same kind of situation. And you might think, well, the sort of cognitively normal thing to do is to rule imposter out right away. Like you shouldn't even really think about imposter as a serious candidate explanation of a strange experience. Like people there aren't qualitatively duplicate imposters running around the world. They're just impossible. So that thing shouldn't be given a moment's thought. And you could imagine how strange it would be to confront somebody who didn't actually believe that their mother was an imposter, or I have a spouse in this quotation, but like they were worried about it all the time. Like if they just kept coming in and like, gosh, I woke up this morning, I was really worried that my spouse was an imposter, but I'm glad that hasn't happened yet. That's a kind of strange thing to present itself. Like just being worried about the possibilities. So you might think, well, in ordinary cognition, these kinds of things, even if you entertain them for a second, get ruled out like absolutely immediately as plausible explanations. And there's lots of evidence from different areas of cognitive science and about how people consider hypotheses when they're trying to explain things. And it looks like we all use a variety of different sort of mechanisms and tricks to kind of rule things out very quickly when we're thinking about possible explanations of something. So there's evidence that depending on the context, people just exclude contextually irrelevant information right away as a possible explanation. Weisberg and Godnick have some evidence that they think that we select hypotheses that we can intervene on as explanations of phenomenon. Those are the things we have preferences for. There's some evidence that we like functional explanations better than non-functional explanations. There's not a lot of work on how it is that we generate hypotheses for explanatory context. So if you're looking for a job to do, figure out how we come up with hypotheses. There's work on how we select hypotheses from like a fixed set, but there's not very much work in thinking about how we come up with a set to begin with. So the proposal that I've made, that I'll make to you, is that one thing that looks like it's true in the Parrott case is that people that develop this delusion have a kind of irregular conception of what's possible. They consider different possibilities as live candidate explanations of the phenomenon. So before, when they're sitting there thinking about how I'm going to explain the occurrence of this weird experience, the kinds of things they think are potential explanations are different than the kinds of things that non-delusional people would think of as potential explanations. They consider things like imposter to be like a plausible candidate in the first place. So whereas I said in non-delusional cognition, that sort of thing gets ruled out immediately, it doesn't for them. Like they think, they sort of entertain it and assign it, maybe they assign it maybe they assign it like a prior probability value or however you want to think about it. Like they think about it as a serious candidate and then it gets processed. Whereas I think for non-delusional people, the imposter hypothesis doesn't even get computed. It doesn't even get considered seriously. So the thought is this. If you were in a position where you thought highly irregular or unusual or impossible things were actually possible, then you'd be more likely to explain the occurrences of strange experiences with delusions as well. So delusions are just the result of, among other things, partially the result of thinking that highly irregular things are possible. And so you might think to yourself, now, well, wait a second. I thought you were trying to tell me that delusions are not so irrational. And isn't that irrational? Isn't it irrational to think that these far-off possibilities are possible, or to think that all these things that couldn't happen could happen? I think that's an excellent question if you're having that question. I put it up there. And what I want to say at the end is, well, maybe not. I don't know. So you might think that the mechanisms, the cognitive mechanisms that are responsible for things like reasoning and inference in delusional subjects manifest hyper-rationality in certain contexts. So I've already sort of suggested that. I said, look, they're really good with conditionals. They're good with falsifying conditionals. It looks like they're good with probability tasks. And those kinds of things only depart from, and maybe the reason they're good at all that stuff is because they have this strange conception of what's possible, or they have a different conception of the space of how things could go. Maybe it's more restricted in some ways and more permissive in other ways. I'm not really sure. And having that only looks like a departure from rationality in highly anomalous contexts. So it's only when I start giving you weird experiences that this cognitive thing starts to look like it's doing something wrong. In the other cases, it's working just fine. So it could be the case that when you're thinking about the cognitive mechanisms involved in delusion, it's not right to think of those things as just rational or irrational. Like, it depends on the tasks and the context that you're in. And it could be that in certain contexts, those things are very rational. But then in other contexts, they start to break down. And then the other thing I was going to say is that, well, it might be wrong to have this kind of stranger conception of possibility, but I'm not really sure that it is a deficit in reasoning. Like, it might be. Might not be. It might just be that you think about possibilities differently, or the space of possibilities differently. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that maybe we're not giving enough weight to the weird experience. So maybe what happens is some experiences are so strange that they just completely fry your conception of what's possible. And you have to start from scratch. So you're kind of going around this world and you have this stable sense of what's possible and not possible, and then you have a really weird experience. And that just throws everything out. And then you have to sort of start rebuilding from ground zero. And in that sort of situation, it's not clear what the constraints would be on how to sort of develop a new conception of possibility. Sometimes Chris Frith tells me stuff like that. So I think he thinks what happens in cases of delusion is that the experience is so weird that it fries everyone's prior probabilities and people just don't know what to do. And they have to sort of build them all up again. And if that's true, then having a sort of unusual conception of possibility is what you might expect. So I'll stop there.
Great, very fun. So Matt will take questions now. Oops.
So I was wondering about
Can you
the
speak up, because there's no...
yeah, I was wondering about the so this is the calculus delusion and the breakdown of the automatic nervous system. So when you don't recognize your mother, you still recognize other people.
Yeah.
You still do. So it's not. So it's a breakdown specific to
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on the case. Some people do have it just towards the motor say. So that's the most problematic case. So just let's stick with that one. So sometimes you'll just it's even worse than that. So it's not just that you only fail to recognize your mother, it's that you only fail to recognize her sometimes. So on I don't know, on Mondays and Tuesdays you think she's an imposter, and on Wednesdays and Thursdays you think she's your mother. So it's not as if the thing whatever it is that's going wrong with the autonomic nervous system isn't kind of sufficient to give you the delusion in every time you see a mother.
Yeah, I was thinking, because then the processing, if you have this possibility and that's the weird experience, and you are comparing that with your experiences with other people, then it explains why would you have suddenly assign a high probability or something.
Yeah.
Sort of going off of that, it sounds like a lot of this explanation reinforces the idea that context is what makes things rational. So, kind of thinking in terms of, this is probably way too complicated, but the idea of a miracle, for instance, that's sort of, especially when we first started recording miracles happening, could potentially be an irrational explanation for something that was just reinforced by context as being possible, if that makes sense. So it sounds like essentially you could, over time, make something that previously was considered irrational based on reinforcing context.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think that this sort of thing is not just true for miracles, but for kind of big paradigm shifts in science and things like that too. So it might be like, well, there's this way of thinking, there's this kind of entrenched way of thinking about a phenomenon, and then there's this whole new way of thinking about a phenomenon that seems weird. When kind of neurobiologists started first talking about action potentials in neurons, like it looked silly. People were like, "Oh, what are you talking about? Like there are ion channels and things." And it's not silly now, but at some point you have to start thinking about things that other people aren't thinking about.
So, I was wondering, do you think we have to think about different delusional disorders in different ways? Because with the Capgras delusion, we know that there is a problem with the limbic system in terms of the ability to think, and with schizophrenia, the delusions come from a smaller reality monitoring process in the brain. So, should we think of these two as completely different and separate from each other, or should we say that they are just delusional disorders and try and talk about delusion disorders in that way?
I don't have strong views about this. I mean, I think generally it's probably, well, I'll say this. So I definitely don't think schizophrenia is a thing. I think that a lot of different things get kind of mushed into that category. So if you were to study schizophrenia, I think you'd probably do better to just study symptoms. And that same thing might be true about delusions. So it might be that rather than thinking about explaining delusions, we should think about explaining particular delusions. There's something interesting, I think, about the fact that so you get misidentification delusions in psychiatric contexts. You also get them from brain damage. So you get it from dementia. So I mean, across all those things, people say the same sort of thing. They say this is an imposter, and it feels like there's something in common in all those cases, even though the underlying ideology is very different.
I was wondering, obviously dementia is a case of structural change within the brain. Do you think that we should consider other delusions, psychiatric delusions, where we can't see a physical structural change to be more like a functional disorder of the brain? Or just
Yeah, it's a good question. I won't say what I think. I'll say what somebody else thinks. So next week I'm going to give these comments on this psychiatrist who's presenting these lectures, and what she thinks is that the right way to think about psychiatric disorders is that they're super complicated, multi-level things. So there's social things, there's functional things, there's genetic things, there's neurobiological things, and part of what is interesting about them is that they have all these complex factors at play, and we don't know how to fit them all together. That seems plausible.
So you have this model, right? You say that believers in schizophrenia they have a larger conception of epistemic possibility, right? So
They think certain things are possible that we don't.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem to me that explanation doesn't recover the fact that delusional people do better in those particular experiments. And I'm wondering how plausible you think the idea is that there's some sort of just limited computing power for non-conscious reasoning, which means that there's some trade-off, say, between form and content. Right? So the fact that they're devoting less of their computational resources to content means they can spend more time setting the form of the arguments and that can explain what they do better.
Yeah, that might be right. I mean, it looks like in the conditional cases that they don't care about the content, like that they, which is the opposite thing that happens in the non-delusional cases. The non-delusional cases that you can predict the judgments based on the content of the sentences. Yeah, so I don't think it's bizarre. I mean, that sounds like a plus.
Has anyone studied that? That seems really plausible.
About the
That you're good at the formal part of the reasoning,
Yeah.
spending your resources on that, and therefore you don't have much,
yeah.
or aren't using the usual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Has anyone studied?
Not that I know.
Look, I'm thinking about this second possibility here, and I was thinking why it would not be a problem in your rationality in the following sense. Rationality is something different from your logical capacities. You can be a very logical person and having a logical line of reasoning, but still not being rational. And I was wondering why you can still call someone a rational person if it has a very bizarre sense of epistemic possibility. Because once you have a very bizarre epistemic possibility, like the case that you are mentioning and explaining here, the trains of thought that you have after having this very bizarre case of epistemic possibility will be all vitiated and not do this ever. So I make the opposite question. Why would, in what sense of rationality you would still call someone with this deficit still a rational person?
Let me just ask you this question, just to get clear on what you're thinking about. So, do you think that would you have the same reaction to someone who didn't believe any of the things? They just thought they were possible. Like they were walking around town saying, I don't believe any of you guys are imposters, obviously, but I mean you could it doesn't take a lot. You guys can be imposters at any moment. But obviously is that as irrational or is it?
Well, I think that depends on the context. In practical life, it would be not rational because in practical life, we are always dealing with probabilities. I mean, if I see my mother, maybe because of a delusion, it will not be her. But in practical life, I'll be completely sure that it's her. If I'm learning about David Hume and skepticism, this could be delusion. I cannot trust anything whatsoever.
Yeah.
When you this kind of thought. But this is a theoretical context. That's what we do in philosophy. People don't believe that the world is outside your mind, it exists.
Yeah.
But in practical life, I think that's a problem.
Just thinking about the possibility.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't have. I mean, that question mark is there to indicate my lack of assertion. I didn't assert that. I'm happy to think it's irrational. I just think it's not obviously a deficit, but I'm happy to think that it is.
Okay, my word just, in practical life, it's not a feature of a personal person. In theoretical life, of course, you can wonder about everything. There is gravity, there is law, there is persons,
Yeah.
everything. But in practical life, we're supposed to have to treat your very highly possibilities as real case.
Yeah.
Like you are my second supervisor, maybe you are double of my supervisor.
Yeah.
But in practical life, I would have very just problems if.
I just can't help think of cases in practical life where if someone didn't believe it was possible, it never would have happened. Like, is it, the I have dream speech, things like that.
Yeah.
Maybe they were irrational, but sometimes in practical life, it's good to have hope in things that, otherwise they're not going to happen. At least they're good things. It's good.
To some extent, I guess we all suffer a bit from the cat grass delusion, but I want to know why it is that we just dismiss the possibility of someone being an imposter, because if someone isn't acting the way you think they should act and they're not behaving in the way they usually would act, we just take it that it's still the same person, but they're not really the same person that we know them to be. Why do we do this?
Do you think that's true for your kind of closest family members, like the people
I
you're
guess
closest
if my mother was acting different, I don't know, when I go home today, she is my mother, but she isn't the person who I know, who I associate as my mother. But why is it that I know rationally it's not right to just dismiss her as my mother 100%? Even though that does make sense, it does make sense to do that. But why do we not do that?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways you might understand that question. So like one question are you interested in? So one question is a question about psychologically what happens. So what happens in my head that makes it the case that I rule these things out? And I think that the answer to that is I don't know what happens at the kind of neural level, but I think psychologically what happens is you have a kind of filter that just stops things from being processed if they occur to you. Your question might be like, what justifies us?
Yeah.
Like, why are we justified in ruling these sorts of things out? And if you think you are justified in ruling them out, I presume it's because you know things like people don't get replaced by imposters. So I can imagine a context where you wouldn't be justified in ruling it out. If the government started replacing people with duplicates, then it would be to your disadvantage to have this kind of filter ruling out that possibility, because it would be more likely that there are imposters running around. And so maybe you're thinking like, well, how do we know that's not happening? I don't know how we know that's not happening.
But in the delusion, it's not that the person's behavior has changed. They behave just as normal.
I mean, they behave as normal. I mean, the one thing I was thinking when you're talking about your mother is like I feel like part of what it is to have a close, intimate relationship with somebody is to realize that like they behave in all sorts of ways. And so I'm very sensitive to like when a colleague at work is behaving in a way that doesn't seem ordinary to me because I don't know them very well. But I know my wife very well, and she has no stable personality. I mean, she like some days she's happy, some days she's not happy, and so no matter what mood she's in, it doesn't ever really throw me off. Like
Into the range.
yeah, within some range. Yeah. It's a pretty big range.
I really like this idea of form and content, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the facial recognition and the feeling of familiarity, because facial recognition is a formal mapping, whereas the familiarity would be the content. And I wonder if it makes a lot of sense that if we look purely at the content, then the imposter wouldn't be an impossibility, and it would actually be quite a reasonable possibility in the sense that, especially if it's only sometimes that the unrecognizability happens, you know that you're the same person, so you would doubt your own self, which rules out the brain damage scenario, so you assume that you're the same person. The second option was weirdness, which seems like a mediating factor, and if it's only occasionally that the unrecognizability happens, then there isn't any different mediating factors between circumstances, which would lead the problem to actually be with the other person rather than at a mediator or within the self, which would make perfect sense why it would be an imposter. So, on that line of reasoning, it seems the most likely solution.
I mean, so a lot depends on what you think is encoded in the experience that you're getting. So if you're looking at this person, you have an experience like the experience is something like this looks just like my mother, but isn't. Now, I mean, if that's what you're getting in your experience, a lot of those things that I said are possible explanations don't explain that. They don't explain the content of that, right? So if what you want to explain is why is this person who's not my mother look like my mother or something like that, then you're not, that's, brain damage is not a good explanation of that. And so part of it depends on that. And then it also, I mean, once you've adopted the belief, if you think that this person's an imposter, there's a way of thinking about counter evidence where it's like, you're not going to get it. So like when your doctor tells you, look, it's your mother, you can be like, that's what I would expect you to say if a very good imposter was there. I mean, that's completely consistent with what I'm thinking. So it's hard to think about how there'd be sufficient counter evidence to that sort of thing.
Yes, I had several thoughts. So one thought is, suppose you embrace the basic possibility that people get replaced by imposters, you would expect that to affect a whole range of things. Yeah, not just the belief about your partner, but in other cases, you're like, maybe you wouldn't get hang because you don't get an imposter experience, so you don't get hang on it. But maybe you go to the supermarket, it's like, are you the same person as yesterday? Oh, yeah. Okay, and then you just ask like, but somehow it's narrowly focused on one.
No, I think that's, I mean, so two things, I mean, so one thought is like, well, the experience is playing part of the role in what's going on. So it might be that if these people had a wider range of strange experiences, that they would develop more delusions. This ties into the question you asked at the beginning about why they have it targeted on one individual and not kind kind of across the board on cases. But the second thing, I think just the proposal about possibilities is empirically disconfirmable, so I think that we could probably design an experiment that tested just what these people thought about possibilities. And it might be wrong, it might be totally off base. But it might be that they go to the market and think all sorts of things are possible. I don't.
Can I go on a bit about it? What about the? I mean, I gather that there is a thing that some people insist on the fact that they do not inquire in the way you would normally inquire. So they don't wonder, oh, today is the imposter, so where is my mother?
Yeah.
Or this kind of stuff like that. Yeah. Also, some people say what's going on is this is very isolated belief. You don't use it in the normal way. You don't make the relevant investigations. You don't check out at the window when the imposter is coming into the house. And so on.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So one of the problems with the delusional cases is that it looks like the kinds of things don't have the sorts of inferential connections that you'd expect, or the connections of action that you would expect. That's not always true. So sometimes people do stuff, but there are plenty of cases where they don't do stuff. That's one of the reasons that some people want to say these things aren't really beliefs. That there's some other kind of thing. And that's, I mean, there's a puzzle there. The other thing I was going to say is that the not inquiring bit, though, looks like it's a general phenomenon with delusional people. So Daniel Freeman's been doing a lot of work on how confident people feel about the judgments they make in delusional cases and non-delusional cases. And it looks like in the non-delusional population, when people make a judgment, if you start pressing them on it, you can get them to back off. Say, oh, well, I mean, maybe not really, or and you can ask some questions like, do you think it's possible that we could find some evidence someday that would show that that's wrong? And people say yes and stuff like this. And delusional subjects seem super confident in the stuff they're saying. Not just in the delusional cases, but across the board and everything. They're like, no, it's, once they say something, they're like, I don't know. That's definitely what things are. So that's a kind of weird, that's a weird thing that's going on there too. It's especially weird, the thing I said right about possibility, because it looks like it's the converse of that.
So I was interested in that, how general the moral point might be, because it looks like people are just something like that, where possibly a very strange experience. Whereas in other cases, what's the strange experience that leads to thinking of Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. But this issue about being resistant to counterfeits, is there a work on what's going on or what's going different from people?
I mean, not much more than the thing I just mentioned to him. I think some people think that evidence just is never in play at all. So it's just that they didn't form the belief on the basis of evidence, and so counter evidence just doesn't matter to them either, because that's not how they form these things.
But I mean, the jumping to conclusions experiment would suggest they do use evidence really well. And this explanation of the Capra, I mean, it is a kind of processing of evidence if you're giving an explanation of a strange experience. So, anyway. Anybody? Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's another line. Okay, it's a weird idea, but And it was just so one thing is that we end up with a two-part explanation of the camera. There's funny experience and there's funny processing of the experience.
Yeah.
And if that's a model, you would expect dissociation.
Yeah.
You would expect people who have the weird experience, but they don't draw a weird conclusion from it. And,
Yeah.
And then maybe we don't observe that, so it's a bit puzzling how do these two things get back.
Yeah.
Here's a suggestion that is in line. Well, actually, the possibility is we have like familiarity feelings towards them. And so, oh, that's a familiar, that's a familiar kind of thing, that's so weird. We use the same words, like strange, like a stranger. So there will be a view that says, oh, actually they have an impairment of the familiarity perception that affects both the familiarity of an actual person and the familiarity of some hypothesis. So that would be a funny thing, but I don't know that it generalizes in like that. Other delusional people also have impairments of familiarity with objects or situations.
Yeah. That's an idea. There is dissociation. So there are people that have the experiences without the delusions.
Okay. How do they describe the experience? Do they say, oh, it really looks like it's not my mother?
Yeah, I mean,
They say
They say that something is that's a bit strange or something.
or just a bit strange. Because, for instance, they were saying, it looks like she's an imposter.
Yeah.
Then it would be like, oh, the content of the
Yeah,
experience is actually an imposter.
They don't say that.
And then people don't do
Yeah.
the internet, so they don't say that. That's not the experience.
So how do we know they're having the same experience if they just say it?
You do the same. I mean, it's the best we can do is what we do is we show people faces and you hook them up to a machine that measures the responses on their skin, and it looks like they're having the same experience in the sense that they also demonstrate this failure of their autonomic sensitivity. But that's all that we can do right now. We're on the verge of being able to peer into consciousness.
Oh.
Yeah. And once we do that,
Is that a couple months away?
yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking, this kind of reminds me of how we kind of reason in dreams. Almost like, we see this person that, well, it kind of is like the opposite, who doesn't really look like our mother, but we say, why are they acting like they're so nurturing? Oh, that's my mother, okay, that makes sense, so I'll jump to the next thing in my dream.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of method of just kind of like, these weird explanations for very strange things that are happening to us. And
Yeah.
just kind of so just an observation.
Yeah. No, dreams are funny.
Yeah.
I don't really know how.
Does anybody compare like delusions and dreams?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think some people think that there are similarities along these kinds of lines. That you're kind of untethered from things in dreams. But it's even harder to know what people are experiencing.
Yeah, it seems that these people jumping from black and white way of reasoning, right? They need to give a very strong explanation. They are not comfortable with words like weird, strange, like cannot be weird, strange. It has to be something very clear. So it's not my mother, then it's an imposter. It's not just, well, it's something strange, but I cannot give it a strong definition. I need to construct something more strange, like precise, right? And maybe it's also for that reason that they seem so rational, because they express everything very clearly.
Yeah, like there's low tolerance for vagueness or binary stuff. Either it's my mother or not. There's an indication that it's not. It's definitely not.
If the binary thing holds, how can they do so well in probabilistic reasoning? Because that's all about fuzziness.
That would be why they cut it off. So
Yeah.
if you want to settle. Yeah, that's the idea. So this one, yeah.
Could you
Yeah, so what is it? I don't know, Chris Fritz. What does he have in mind for? I'm a bit puzzled about the idea of building up space possibilities again. So, what do you mean by how an experience could just obliterate priors? What,
So Frith, Frith kind of thinks the way that the way he thinks about it now is that we kind of have all these models in our head about how the world is, and those models kind of assign probabilities to various things. We're kind of going around the world and we're making adjustments in the model, and we're making adjustments to the probabilities as we get feedback. And this is all driven by sensory experience at some level. And whenever anything goes wrong, you'll get like a kind of signal of error. Most of the time, the signals you get are very, very small. And so you just have to make a little change. So you tweak your model a little bit, or you tweak your probabilities a little bit, and then everything is fine. And what he thinks happens in these kinds of cases is you get a massive spike on the error signal. And it's so big that what you end up doing is just dumping the whole model. And then you have nothing. And in that situation, you have to start over. And one sort of question that people raise for this entire way of thinking is like, well, where does that model come from in the first place? And you might have things to say, well, I mean, if you start as an infant, you develop it over time, or maybe bits of it are innate or something like that. But there's no good way of thinking about where it comes from when it's totally gone. So I think what he thinks is that if you dump the whole model, then you're in this really bad place. But you're also in this place where there's no constraints on what to do next. So this whole thing about the game and saving, I mean, that's just something you could think, because you're not getting any empirical stuff that's really not thing out.
Thanks.
So what does that have to do with rationality then, this sort of predictive coding model that you just invoked to explain the idea that some people can have such a radical experience that the rest of them...
I'm not quite hearing you, sorry.
What does that have to do with rationality? Because predictive coding normally happens at a sort of subclassic level.
Yeah.
Which
So I think what Chris Frith thinks, or a lot of people think, is that the computational processing in predictive coding is Bayesian. And you can think that Bayesianism gives you a picture of rationality. So it tells you how you should adjust values and probabilities in light of new information. So if everything's going smoothly with your predictive coding brain, you're going to update your probabilities in line with Bayes' rule. And things are going wrong when you start updating your probabilities in different ways. And there are various reasons that could happen, also personally. So that gives you a way of latching the notion of rationality into some personal process.
Okay. Is it just like a slightly different conception of rationality than the one you were talking about in the delusional cases?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, not too different than the jumping to conclusions conception of rationality. Yeah, do it in Barman.
Okay, just a few announcements. You might already know about the essay contest. The due date is coming up after reading, so look at our website for that, philosophy-of-medicine.org. And the next colloquium is going to be November 10th. That'll be at Guy's campus, also about mental health, this time with a legal angle to it. Surviving the Sirens, should there be advanced directives for bipolar? For the bipolar patient to designate ahead of time how that they should be treated even when they don't want to be. So, join us then. That one has a slight time change, 5 to 6:30 rather than 4:30 to 6. And please join me in thanking Matt for coming today, and thank all of you for